We live in a world that constantly demands our voices. Every day, we are urged to speak up, explain ourselves, defend our choices. In meetings, on social media, in our relationships, the pressure to be heard can feel overwhelming. There's an unspoken assumption that if we don't constantly justify our actions, we risk being misunderstood, judged, or dismissed. But what if the key to true power isn't found in defending ourselves, but in choosing when and how not to speak at all? Let me tell you a story. In the early 1990s, an up-and-coming writer was invited to speak at a prestigious literary event. The audience expected insight, anecdotes, maybe a little self-reflection. But instead of speaking, the writer simply sat. In silence, the room fell into a heavy, uncomfortable stillness. What happened next? Silence, it turns out, became the most powerful statement he could make. That writer was none other than Thomas Pynchon, one of the most enigmatic and influential authors of our time. By choosing silence over explanation, he became a symbol of intellectual authority, a figure who let his work speak for itself. Pynchon's silence wasn't passive. It wasn't out of fear or insecurity. It was an act of calculated power. It sent a message: some things don't need to be explained. His very refusal to engage with the expectations of the public gave him control over his narrative, reinforcing his mystique and allowing his work to be viewed through the lens of intrigue, not explanation. This moment raises an essential question. Why do we feel the need to explain ourselves? And more importantly, what happens when we stop? When we choose silence instead of words? Do we give up control, or do we reclaim it in a way that words never could? The power of silence is subtle but profound. It's not about withdrawing. It's about understanding that sometimes the absence of explanation is the most powerful statement we can make. Silence isn't just the absence of noise, it's an act of authority, of control, and of presence. As we delve deeper into this exploration, we'll uncover why silence is so threatening to societal norms, why we've been taught to fear it, and why, perhaps, the greatest strength lies not in our ability to speak but in our willingness to remain silent. When the world expects us to explain. Every day, we find ourselves justifying our actions, explaining our thoughts, even defending our choices. Whether it's in the workplace, in relationships, or online, the need to be understood and validated seems to be an unavoidable part of human existence. But why? Why do we feel such an urgent, almost primal need to explain ourselves to others? Why, when faced with criticism or judgment, do we instinctively offer up words in an attempt to assuage the fear of being misunderstood? To answer these questions, we must first understand the psychological framework that shapes human behavior. At the core of this is a concept deeply rooted in our evolutionary makeup: validation. It's tied to our very survival. In our ancestral past, the approval of the group was critical. It meant safety, security, access to resources, and survival. A person who wasn't accepted or understood by their community risked being ostracized, and, in a primitive world, ostracization could mean death. Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, explored the concept of the ego as the part of us that seeks to make sense of the world and protect our self-image. According to Freud, humans are driven by an unconscious desire for approval from others. This validation-seeking behavior is not just a social construct, it's an instinctual drive deeply ingrained in our psyche. We crave recognition, affirmation, and approval because, at its core, it speaks to a deeper need: the need to be seen, to be acknowledged, and to be part of a group. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, took this understanding further. He argued that much of human behavior is driven by what he called the collective unconscious, a shared set of symbols and experiences that bind us together as humans. For Jung, our need for validation isn't just about securing a place in society, it's about aligning with a deeper, collective meaning. We don't just want to be recognized for who we are. We want to be recognized as part of something greater than ourselves. But what happens when this need for validation goes unchecked? As we moved from hunter-gatherer societies to more complex civilizations, this drive evolved in ways that we didn't always fully understand. It became less about survival and more about social positioning, reputation, and identity. In the modern world, this has only intensified. Take a look at social media, platforms that demand constant self-presentation and self-explanation. Here, validation is no longer something that occurs in real-time interactions, but something that is curated and commodified. Every post, tweet, or photo is an attempt to explain who we are, what we believe, and why we matter. The likes, shares, and comments we receive in return feed into our ego, reaffirming our sense of self-worth, or, at least, our perceived worth in the eyes of others. But this need for external validation isn't just a product of modern technology. It's a reflection of something much deeper, a cultural and societal force that amplifies our instinctual desires. We are constantly bombarded by messages telling us that we need to be louder, more visible, more transparent, and more explainable in order to be accepted or valued. We've been taught that if we're not speaking, we're invisible. If we don't explain ourselves, we risk being misunderstood or ignored. And herein lies the paradox. The more we explain ourselves, the less control we actually have. Every justification we offer is, in a sense, a concession of power. In our desperate bid for validation, we give away our autonomy, our narrative, and sometimes even our integrity. The more we defend our actions, the more vulnerable we become to the judgments of others. This cycle of validation-seeking behavior creates a tension between our innate desire to be understood and the subtle, often overlooked truth that silence may, in fact, be the more powerful response. When we stop explaining ourselves, we stop surrendering our power to external forces. We stop seeking approval from others, and in doing so, we reclaim control over our own identity. But how did we come to this point? How did we go from a world where validation was a matter of survival to one where it's an almost compulsive need? And what does this mean for us, both as individuals and as a society? These are the questions we must confront as we move forward in our exploration of silence and its hidden power. As we dive deeper into this journey, we will begin to understand that the need for validation is not just a personal flaw or insecurity. It is a product of a broader societal construct. It's a reflection of a culture that values visibility over substance, noise over quietude, and approval over self-awareness. And in this construct, silence becomes not just a void, but a powerful resistance, a way of reclaiming our autonomy in a world that demands we explain ourselves at every turn. The notion of silence as power is not a modern invention. It has been understood, manipulated, and wielded throughout history by those who sought to shape the course of empires, revolutions, and societal movements. Silence, when employed strategically, is not a passive retreat. It is an active assertion of control. Across the ages, figures who understood this truth have used silence to maintain authority, subvert enemies, and bend the course of history to their will. Let's go back in time to the 16th century. One of the most influential political figures of the era, Niccolò Machiavelli, famously argued in his work The Prince that it is better to be feared than loved. Yet, Machiavelli's strategy for maintaining power was not just about domination. Through force, it was about the calculated use of words and silence. A ruler who speaks too much, he warned, risks losing control over their narrative. The prudent leader, on the other hand, speaks only when necessary, allowing silence to convey strength and mystery. By withholding information or response, a ruler could keep their subjects and rivals in a constant state of uncertainty, which in turn granted the ruler an upper hand in decision-making. Machiavelli's philosophy extended beyond the realm of monarchs. His advice was a precursor to modern power dynamics, where the individual who knows when to remain silent often holds the greatest power. In an era of constant political intrigue, where the mouths of ministers, generals, and courtiers were often louder than the throne itself, silence became a tool of mastery over the flow of information and therefore the levers of power. But silence wasn't only the domain of kings and politicians. In ancient Rome, philosophers like the Stoics also understood the transformative potential of silence. Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic philosophers, frequently spoke about the necessity of inner calm and quiet reflection in the face of external chaos. For them, silence wasn't merely the absence of sound. It was an act of inner discipline, a conscious withdrawal from the noise of the world. In their eyes, silence was not just a personal virtue, but a powerful form of resistance. When the world pushed them to react, they instead chose to reflect, giving themselves the space to make decisions based on reason, not impulse. Take Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor and Stoic philosopher. He often faced turmoil both within his empire and within his own court. Instead of responding rashly or giving in to the pressures of those around him, he frequently turned to silence. During times of crisis, he would retreat into his thoughts, writing down his reflections and meditations. In the midst of political betrayal, military conflict, and personal struggle, his silence became a fortress, a shield against the forces that sought to manipulate and control him. It was through silence that he maintained his autonomy and ultimately his power. His decision not to react immediately to challenges, but to deliberate and choose his actions carefully, became the foundation of his strength. But silence was also used as a weapon of resistance. During the civil rights movement, for example, silence played a profound role in defying the oppressive systems of the time. The sit-ins, protests, and silent marches were not just demonstrations of dissent. They were also powerful acts of resistance through silence. By refusing to speak, the protesters denied the oppressors the satisfaction of an argument, an excuse for violence. Silence became a means of asserting moral superiority, a tactic that not only gained widespread attention, but also exposed the raw ugliness of a society that demanded to be justified at every turn. The power of silence in historical contexts is not limited to public figures or social movements. Even in the most personal and intimate moments, silence has been used to assert power and control. Take the case of powerful women throughout history who, in a patriarchal world, learned that silence could be more potent than words. Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, was one such figure. Not only was she known for her intelligence and political acumen, but she also understood the power of silence in diplomacy. She would often choose to say little, letting her actions and the weight of her presence speak louder than anything she could utter. By controlling her speech, she controlled how others perceived her and her power. Her silence became an integral part of her allure and influence, both within her court and across the Roman Empire. In each of these cases, whether it was Machiavelli's political strategies, the Stoic philosopher's quiet self-discipline, the civil rights protests, or Cleopatra's regal composure, silence served as more than a mere absence of noise. It was a weapon, a tool, and a shield. It was an essential element in the complex dance of power. Silence allowed these figures to shape public perception, to manipulate situations from behind the scenes, and to maintain control over their own narrative. History teaches us that silence is not weakness, as we are often led to believe in a world that prioritizes noise, speed, and visibility. Instead, silence can be one of the most deliberate and powerful tools at our disposal. When deployed with purpose, silence allows us to sidestep manipulation, to avoid traps set by the loudest voices, and to maintain the clarity and focus required to exercise true authority. As we look toward the present day, we see that silence remains just as vital a tool for those who seek to shape the world. In the next sections, we'll explore how this principle has been distorted in the modern age, where the demands for constant explanation and visibility threaten to erode the very power that silence once granted. But before we get there, let us pause and reflect. What do we lose when we forget the lessons of history? When we silence ourselves out of fear rather than out of strength? What might we gain by reclaiming silence as an intentional strategy, rather than letting the noise of the world drown out our inner authority? We live in a time where the instinct to explain ourselves has become almost a reflex. When we feel judged, misunderstood, or criticized, the immediate response is often to defend, clarify, or justify. But what happens when we give in to this urge too often? What are the costs, psychological, social, and even professional, that come with the habit of over-explaining? The need to explain oneself can seem like a necessary part of human interaction, but the act of over-explaining can lead to profound and damaging consequences. At a psychological level, when we repeatedly justify our actions or thoughts to others, We create an inner conflict that's known as cognitive dissonance. This term, coined by the psychologist Leon Festinger, refers to the discomfort we experience when our beliefs or actions don't align with our own understanding of ourselves. For example, if we explain our actions too much, trying to convince others that our decisions were valid, we risk reinforcing the idea that we don't trust our own judgment. The more we try to justify ourselves, the more we plant seeds of doubt in our own minds. We become trapped in a cycle of self-questioning, unable to fully trust our instincts or our decisions. Over-explaining also takes a toll on our mental health. Research shows that the constant need to defend or justify can lead to increased stress and anxiety. When we feel the need to explain every decision, every choice, or every opinion, we begin to doubt ourselves. The fear of being misunderstood or judged intensifies, and this pressure can chip away at our sense of self-worth. It's as if we're constantly living under the gaze of others, never quite able to stand confidently in our own skin. The more we explain, the more we become dependent on others' validation. In turn, our sense of identity becomes fragile, contingent upon the approval of those around us. But the consequences of over-explaining aren't confined to our inner lives. In the social realm, over-explaining can lead to a loss of authority and credibility in both personal and professional relationships. Those who over-explain are often perceived as insecure, unsure, or even manipulative. When we feel the need to justify ourselves constantly, others begin to see us as lacking conviction. They sense that we're unsure of our position, and this can undermine our influence in a conversation or negotiation. People who are confident in their words and confident in their silence tend to command respect, while those who over-explain often seem as if they're seeking approval. This dynamic is especially visible in professional settings. Think about the workplace, where the pressure to constantly explain oneself can lead to reduced effectiveness. A manager who over-explains their decisions, for example, may inadvertently communicate a lack of confidence in their judgment. The more they justify their actions, the more their authority erodes, because employees begin to question the rationale behind their decisions. Over-explaining in the workplace can create an atmosphere of doubt and insecurity, rather than confidence and clarity. The same is true in personal relationships. When we constantly explain ourselves to a partner, a friend, or a family member, we send the message that we need their approval. This can lead to a dynamic where we feel like we're always walking on eggshells, trying to manage how others perceive us. This need for validation can make us less authentic, as we become more focused on justifying our actions than on being true to ourselves over time. This can breed resentment, as the emotional labor of justifying ourselves drains both parties. In the relationship, in fact, over-explaining can be a subtle form of manipulation, even if it's unintentional. When we over-explain, we attempt to control how others perceive us or our actions. We're not merely offering clarity, we're trying to steer their opinions in a certain direction. This subtle manipulation can backfire, as people begin to sense that something is off. They may start to feel that their own perspectives are being undermined, or that they're being pulled into a narrative that they didn't ask for. In this way, over-explaining becomes a tool of self-defense, but it can also make others feel controlled, leaving the person who over-explains feeling more isolated and misunderstood than ever. It's clear that the impulse to justify ourselves, while natural, can be harmful. Over-explaining often leads us to a place of insecurity, self-doubt, and reduced influence. But here's the paradox. The more we explain, the less control we have over the narrative. The less we trust ourselves and our decisions, the more vulnerable we become to others' judgment. We become entangled in a web of justification, never quite able to find peace in our own choices. So, what's the alternative? The power of silence. When we stop explaining ourselves, we stop seeking validation from others. We reclaim our autonomy, our self-worth, and our influence. Silence is not just the absence of words, it's the presence of inner authority. When we choose not to over-explain, we allow our actions to speak for themselves, and in doing so, we become more authentic, more confident, and more powerful. In the next sections, we'll explore how silence, when practiced with intention, becomes a tool not just for personal empowerment, but for navigating a world that constantly pressures us to speak, to justify, and to explain. Through silence, we regain control of our narratives, our relationships, and our own sense of self. There's a form of silence that goes beyond mere withdrawal or avoidance. This is non-reactive silence, a silence that is not passive but purposeful. It is an art, a skill that requires deep self-awareness and emotional control. Non-reactive silence is a conscious choice, an act of self-mastery that allows us to navigate the chaos of life without losing our inner peace. At its core, non-reactive silence is about choosing not to engage impulsively with the external world. It's the refusal to be drawn into the noise, the endless debates, the emotional reactions that seek to provoke us. This type of silence doesn't just happen. It is an intentional practice of controlling one's emotional impulses and maintaining equanimity. In the face of challenge, it is the ability to be still, to observe, and to respond, if at all not from a place of reactivity, but from a place of calm strength. One of the best places to explore the power of non-reactive silence is in the teachings of Zen Buddhism. Zen encourages practitioners to embrace silence as a path to enlightenment. It is not merely about shutting out the world, but about opening oneself to the present moment. In Zen, silence is seen as the gateway to deeper understanding. By observing the world around us with quiet awareness, we detach from the constant stream of thoughts and judgments that cloud our perception. This mental silence, this non-reactive presence, becomes a space where clarity and insight can arise. Consider the Zen koan, a paradoxical question used to break through the normal patterns of thought. A classic example is the question, "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" On the surface, this question makes no sense. But in the silence that follows, after all attempts to understand have been exhausted, something profound happens. The mind begins to quiet, and in that stillness, the answer isn't found in words or reasoning. It is discovered in a deep, intuitive knowing that transcends logic. It is silence that unlocks insight, making the seemingly impossible comprehensible. This practice of intentional silence can be applied in our own lives, especially when faced with conflict or emotional turmoil. We all know the feeling of being provoked, of being pushed to react in the heat of the moment. Whether in a heated conversation, a stressful situation at work, or even a conflict with loved ones, the impulse to react immediately can be overwhelming. But non-reactive silence allows us to resist that pull. It allows us to pause, to breathe, and to choose how we respond rather than simply reacting from our emotions. This idea of emotional regulation through silence is not a new one. In ancient Greece, the Stoics taught that true strength lies in the ability to control one's emotions. Epictetus, one of the most prominent Stoic philosophers, argued that we cannot control external events, but we can control how we respond to them. He often advised his followers to embrace silence in the face of provocation, not as an act of submission, but as a conscious choice to maintain inner peace. For the Stoics, silence was not the absence of emotion, but the mastery of it. By choosing silence, they were asserting their control over their own reactions, refusing to be swept away by the tides of anger, frustration, or fear. In modern psychological practices, silence is seen as an essential tool for emotional resilience. Mindfulness, a practice rooted in Buddhist traditions and popularized in the West, teaches us to be present in the moment, observing our thoughts and feelings without becoming attached to them. In a similar way, non-reactive silence encourages us to acknowledge our emotions without letting them control us. By remaining silent in moments of stress or anger, we create the space to reflect, to observe, and ultimately to choose how we wish to respond. This space of silence is where emotional intelligence grows, where resilience is built. Non-reactive silence is also deeply tied to assertiveness. While many people associate assertiveness with speaking out and defending one's position, the truth is that silence can be one of the most powerful forms of assertiveness. When someone attempts to provoke us or manipulate us, choosing silence instead of engaging in a defensive argument sends a powerful message. It says, "I do not need to explain myself to you," or "I am not going to be drawn into this." This form of silence is not passive, but assertive. It is a way of reclaiming control over the situation, maintaining your boundaries, and refusing to be pulled into unnecessary conflict. The power of silence in communication has been well documented by body language experts like Albert Mehrabian, who conducted pioneering research on how people interpret nonverbal cues. According to Mehrabian, when it comes to communication, only 7% of our message is conveyed through words, while 38% is conveyed through tone of voice and 55% through body language. In this light, silence becomes a profound form of communication. The absence of words can speak volumes, conveying confidence, control, and emotional strength. When we choose silence in a conversation, we allow our presence to dominate the interaction. This is especially powerful in situations where words are cheap, where arguments are often used as tools of manipulation or persuasion. Silence, in these moments, can disrupt the usual flow of dialogue and force others to confront their own assumptions and beliefs. To truly embrace the art of non-reactive silence, it is helpful to develop specific practices in our daily lives. One simple practice is the pause. When we are about to speak in a conversation, especially if we feel emotional or defensive, taking a moment of silence before responding can be transformative. This brief pause allows us to check in with ourselves, to assess our emotions, and to decide whether speaking is truly necessary or whether silence will serve us better. It can be as simple as taking a deep breath, letting the moment breathe, and allowing our response to emerge from a place of calm rather than reflex. Another practice is to cultivate an awareness of our body language. Often, we may remain silent, but still give away our feelings through our posture, facial expressions, or eye contact. By consciously relaxing our body, softening our expression, and maintaining neutral or open body language, we can ensure that our silence remains powerful rather than passive. This practice of embodied silence reinforces the idea that silence is not a withdrawal, but a presence, an assertion of who we are in the face of external pressure. The art of non-reactive silence is, at its core, a practice of emotional and psychological mastery. It allows us to navigate the chaos of the world with grace and control, choosing when to speak and when to remain silent with intention. By embracing this silence, we reclaim our power, our boundaries, and our agency. In the end, silence is not just the absence of sound. It is the presence of inner strength. In modern society, there's a subtle yet powerful expectation placed upon us, the need to explain ourselves, whether it's in our personal lives, our professional interactions, or even in public discourse. There's an overwhelming pressure to justify, clarify, and reveal ourselves at all times. This culture of over-explaining has become so ingrained in the fabric of society that it's often seen as a virtue. Transparency, emotional openness, and self-disclosure are celebrated as markers of authenticity and self-awareness. But beneath the seemingly innocent urge to share lies a far more insidious reality. A world that thrives on our need to justify our existence, our actions, and our beliefs. And the more we reveal, the less power we have over how we are perceived. The pressure to explain ourselves is, in many ways, a construction, a social mechanism built to ensure compliance, to foster visibility, and to reinforce control. As the philosopher Michel Foucault argued in his theory of power and knowledge, the more we disclose, the more we open ourselves up to scrutiny, judgment, and ultimately manipulation. Foucault explored how societies have created structures where knowledge and control are deeply intertwined. He argued that power doesn't just come from those who rule. It is embedded in the very way we are encouraged to live our lives, to be transparent, and to share everything about ourselves. The more we explain, the more we expose ourselves to the control of external forces, be they media, corporations, or political entities. Take, for example, the way corporations and political figures interact with the public in today's world. In the age of social media, brands and politicians are constantly asking us to know them better. Transparency is the new buzzword, but what is often portrayed as genuine openness is, in fact, a strategy designed to foster a false sense of intimacy and trust. Politicians share their personal lives. Companies reveal the behind the scenes of their operations. Celebrities broadcast their most intimate thoughts and moments. The idea is to create a sense of connection, to make the public feel like they know them personally. But the more these figures disclose, the more they surrender control over their image and narrative. The public's perception becomes shaped not by the reality of their actions or beliefs, but by the carefully curated and often manipulated narratives they choose to reveal. And the more they reveal, the more they become subject to the whims of public opinion, to the fleeting judgments of the masses. This culture of oversharing is not just confined to the realm of public figures. It extends deeply into our personal lives. In a world where the demand for constant disclosure is ever present, we are encouraged to share every detail of our lives, to open up, to be real, to offer up personal information that we once might have kept private. Social media platforms, in particular, thrive on this model, where the more we share, the more engagement and validation we receive. Yet, this sharing economy comes with a cost. The more we reveal about ourselves, the more vulnerable we become, and in the end, the more we lose control over how we are perceived and how we perceive ourselves. By constantly explaining our actions, our thoughts, and our emotions, we allow others to define our narrative. We place our sense of self-worth in the hands of external validation, leaving us open to manipulation, judgment, and scrutiny. The danger here is not just that we lose control over our image, but that the very act of explaining ourselves chips away at our personal autonomy. The more we justify, the less room we have for our own internal authority. There's a subtle but profound psychological shift that occurs when we feel compelled to constantly explain our choices, our beliefs, and our actions. Each time we do so, we inadvertently signal that our worth is dependent on the approval or understanding of others. This undermines our sense of autonomy and personal power. We stop owning our decisions and instead seek constant validation from the outside world. This dynamic can be particularly damaging in the context of personal relationships. When we feel the need to over-explain to others, we implicitly give away power. A partner, friend, or colleague who is constantly asked to justify their actions or thoughts begins to feel trapped in an endless cycle of proving their worth. The act of over-explaining becomes an exhausting, one-sided transaction where the individual's worth is tied to their ability to satisfy external expectations. In such relationships, true intimacy and trust are often replaced by performance, constantly trying to manage how one is seen by the other, rather than simply being in the workplace. This need for constant justification can also lead to a dilution of personal power. Consider the employee who feels the constant need to explain every decision they make, or the leader who has to justify every move. In these scenarios, the individual gives up their authority in favor of external validation. This behavior, over time, reduces their effectiveness, not only in their professional roles, but in their sense of self-confidence. The more we try to explain ourselves, the more we place ourselves in a reactive position, constantly trying to defend or rationalize our actions. This undermines the strength that comes from being grounded in our own judgment, our own values, and our own sense of purpose. What, then, is the alternative? How can we break free from this social construction that demands constant explanation and justification? The answer lies in reclaiming control over our own narrative. To stop explaining ourselves to the world, we must first stop seeking validation from others. We must learn to trust our own judgment, to stand firm in our decisions, and to allow our actions to speak for themselves. We don't need to explain every choice or every belief. Silence, both in action and in speech, becomes our strength. It is a refusal to be drawn into a world that demands constant justification, and a conscious decision to preserve our autonomy, our dignity, and our personal power. The more we embrace silence as a tool of personal authority, the more we reclaim our power in a world that seeks to strip it away. In a culture that thrives on oversharing, the refusal to explain ourselves becomes an act of profound resistance. It is in this silence that we discover our true selves, untouched, unmanipulated, and free. Silence, often perceived as passive or inert, can be one of the most potent forms of resistance in the face of oppression. In a world that thrives on noise, be it through media, politics, or the ceaseless chatter of social networks. Silence is a radical act. It challenges authority, disrupts the status quo, and refuses to be swept up in the orchestrated narrative of those in power. Silence, when used consciously and with purpose, becomes not a retreat, but a bold stand, an act of defiance against the systems that seek to control and manipulate us. Consider the profound moments of silence in history that have marked pivotal turning points in human struggle. The civil rights movement in the United States is a powerful example. It was not just the passionate speeches of Martin Luther King Jr. or the marches that galvanized millions, but also the moments of quiet resistance that carried immense weight. Take, for example, the lunch counter sit-ins. Students sat in silence at counters where they were not served, refusing to engage in the hostile actions directed at them. The silence was deafening. It said more than words could ever convey. It communicated the strength of their resolve, the power of their dignity, and their refusal to be complicit in an unjust system. Their silence rejected the oppressive norms and, in doing so, exposed the deep ugliness of segregation. Similarly, the silent protests against authoritarian regimes throughout history reveal the subversive power of silence. In the face of brutal suppression, individuals and groups have turned to silence as an act of defiance. In Eastern Europe, during the Cold War, the people who lived under oppressive regimes often found that speaking out could cost them their lives. Yet, even in the darkest times, silence became a means of protest and intentional absence of compliance with the demands of the state. In places like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, dissidents who were unable to speak openly would refuse to participate in public ceremonies, parades, or any form of state-sanctioned activity. Their absence, their silence, became a powerful statement, one that resonated louder than any public outcry. By not participating, they sent a clear message to their oppressors: we do not accept this. Silence is also woven into the fabric of spiritual resistance. Consider the practice of silent meditation and fasting, which has been used as a form of protest against political or spiritual corruption. Mahatma Gandhi, a leader of the Indian independence movement, famously used silence as a tool of nonviolent resistance. His hunger strikes and periods of silence were a direct challenge to the British Empire's oppressive rule in India. Gandhi's silence was not a surrender or a withdrawal. It was a refusal to engage in the violent rhetoric and actions of the British authorities. By choosing silence, he was able to expose the moral decay of colonialism and stand firm in his pursuit of truth and justice. In his case, silence was a deeply spiritual act, a means of aligning oneself with higher principles and resisting the corrupting influence of colonial power. In many indigenous cultures, silence has been revered, not just as an absence of speech, but as a sacred space of wisdom and reflection. In Native American traditions, silence is often regarded as a form of rebellion against the fast-paced, consumer-driven culture that surrounds them. It is seen as a reclaiming of agency, a way to preserve one's inner self against the noise and distractions of modern life. Silence, in this context, is an assertion of independence, a way of resisting the pressures to conform and to be swallowed by the dominant culture. This view of silence as a radical act of self-preservation and resistance is also echoed in other spiritual traditions, such as Zen Buddhism, where silence is not merely the absence of sound, but a profound connection to one's true nature, untouched by the illusions of the material world. The cultural perceptions of silence, however, vary widely across societies. In some cultures, silence is seen as a sign of respect, while in others, it is interpreted as a form of subordination. Yet, across these differences, there remains a common thread. Silence is often viewed as a powerful tool to resist. In authoritarian societies, where the truth is often manipulated and the individual voice is suppressed, silence becomes a form of rebellion against the state's demand for conformity. By withholding words, individuals deny the power structures, their desired narrative. They refuse to participate in the political theater that the regime seeks to stage, and in doing so, they disrupt the flow of power. Silence can render the voices of the oppressors hollow, revealing their impotence. But how does silence work as a tool of resistance on a psychological level? To understand this, we must explore how silence disorients the systems of control. Power, particularly in oppressive systems, thrives on the need for constant communication and justification. The state wants you to speak, to confess, to explain. This is a tool of control. It allows them to mold your narrative, to shape your reality, and to keep you in a constant state of reaction. When silence enters the equation, however, it disrupts this process. The silence is not an absence of communication. It is an active refusal to be manipulated. It does not allow the oppressor to predict, to control, or to twist the narrative. The silence forces those in power to confront their own lies, their own failures. It exposes the hollowness of their authority. This dynamic is powerfully illustrated in movements that reject not just the authority of the state, but the very systems that sustain it. Silence becomes a form of psychological warfare, a tool that undermines the confidence and control of the oppressor. In some cases, this silence leads to a deep psychological shift among those who witness it. Whether they are part of the establishment or the general public, it creates doubt, cracks the facade of invulnerability, and forces those in power to confront the human spirit's unyielding will to resist. The silence we speak of here is not mere withdrawal or submission. It is the silence of strength, of resistance, of defiance. It is the quiet refusal to conform to the narratives imposed upon us, to play the game of justification and manipulation. It is the silence of those who know that true power lies not in speaking the loudest, but in knowing when to remain silent, knowing that silence itself can speak volumes.